First, I want to thank FAP for this great opportunity, not only giving me a chance to speak with you and have discussions with you, but also a great honor for me to appear with my distinguished Yale colleagues. I have to say that Professor Kennedy gave such a wonderful presentation, and Ambassador gave such a wonderful discussion. That has both of them have set the standard so high, so it's very tough for me to deliver satisfactory. I will focus my remarks on the impact of the ongoing financial crisis on mostly China, and just a little bit on Brazil, on the U.S., and then a little bit on what this means for Brazil-China relations going forward for the rest of this century. But first, let me say that clearly the financial crisis and the upcoming economic crisis as a result of this will weaken the U.S. economy quite significantly. But at the same time, I have to say that don't underestimate the ability of the American economy and the society to correct mistakes and or deficient institutional elements, especially given the fact that this crisis is, of course, not as bad as the one that happened in the 1930s. So if the United States was able to come out of the Great Depression not only not weaker, but much stronger, I think we should have quite a lot of confidence in the ability this time. Although I do share with Professor Kennedy's concerns regarding, the somewhat disappointing trend of the last many years, especially over the last 8 years. My second point that I want to touch upon is that the impact of this crisis on China in the very short term, within the next 1 or 2 years, will be very significant. So the real economy, especially the export sectors for China, are being very much affected. But at the same time, I will say that this also presents a great opportunity for China. Especially in 2 to 3 years, if we look back at that time, the challenge to the Chinese government will provide some positive pressure, will force the Chinese government to take more fundamental reforms that otherwise would not have been thinkable, even several months ago, not to mention several years ago. Because life has been just too good for the last 30 years. Fast economic growth for such a long time has made not just the Chinese officials, but also the general public, intellectuals in China to be very cocky and very almost too confident about their own abilities. So many of my colleagues and my friends in China and myself had been very much concerned about what this overconfidence will really take China to. In some ways, unfortunately and luckily, now we have an opportunity to really test the Chinese government and the Chinese society for the first time in 30 years. So this challenge and this test, I believe, will be passed quite successfully. So this is why overall, I think that China will probably come out as a significant winner from this crisis. Well, at the same time, I have to emphasize that in terms of the roles by China on the international stage, China today and also in the near future will still be a very reluctant player on the international stage. Mainly because the Chinese government, I think, is not really ready to take on a larger role globally, partly because of the educational content at the universities in China, and also the fact most of the officials at the minister level and higher in China today are engineers. So it's a very strange thing for them to be forced to be playing a bigger role on the international stage. So for this reason, and also for other reasons, I don't think the rise of China will really present any real challenge to the United States of America, partly because the two countries are so tied together. I cannot imagine that China can get by without the support of the U.S. And for that reason, for example, many people think that the Chinese military has been rising in power and so on. But I have to tell you that don't expect China's Navy or Air Force to be of any significance in any time soon, okay, at least. And then for that reason, they support the maintenance of the international order for trade, not to mention other things, even the ocean, the waterway safety for cargo ships to be able to go smoothly without being hijacked by pirates and so on. China needs that, and the Chinese Navy and military cannot provide the kind of protection as the American military can and the U.S. Navy can. So I think for China, I think personally and also many people, many of my friends in the Chinese government will agree with me that a somewhat unipolar international order is probably the best for China's trade to be maintained and expanded going forward. So at least I hope that China would not mistakenly try to pursue some multipolar system. But I do agree with Professor Kennedy that whether I like it or not, somehow as the U.S. position being weakened, probably there will be challenges to the existing order. And then lastly, I will also touch upon the importance of the intra-emerging market relations, such as Brazil and China and other emerging markets for the near future, for the next decade or so at least. So I will share with you some numbers in terms of the trend of the China developed country economic relations versus the China-Brazil economic relations. So first, let me explain just quickly why I think China may come out of this crisis as an overall winner in the longer term. In the short term, obviously, as I mentioned, the export sector and then hence the real economy of China will be badly affected. But at the same time, there are many positives. The first obvious positive is the huge reduction in oil price and other raw material prices. And for the last 2 years especially, one of the biggest topics for debate in China was the question, where will China's oil, energy, and other resource demands be supplied? So as prices went higher and higher for all those resource products and so on, China was very, very deeply concerned. So now, as a result of this crisis, all the prices for resources have pretty much been cut in half or more. So this presents a significant gift to China for the next round of fast economic growth. Secondly, China has roughly $2 trillion of foreign exchange reserves. Almost half of that is in U.S. Treasury securities and also various mortgage-backed securities. But at the same time, at a time like this, with so much foreign exchange reserve, according to some official estimates internally within the Chinese government, they think that for China to be really in absolute safe territory, China really only needs about 600 to 700 billion US dollars of reserves just to prepare for the worst possible financial crisis that might take place in China. On top of that, the remaining 1.3 trillion US dollars of reserve would be have been unnecessary. So China can actually use this huge reserve for other purposes. For example, helping countries that have suffered a lot from the ongoing crisis, and then especially help major trading partners. So Brazil is one of the major trading partners, especially for this year. The total trade volume increase between Brazil and China for the first half of this year is 86%. That makes Brazil the second fastest growing trade partner for China. So this is why I have heard from both friends here and also many friends in China, the level of interest for officials, business executives, and others to come to visit Brazil are very, very high. So I know quite a few friends who will come next month. And so that's, I think this trend is interesting. So for that reason, I think there is a lot of interest. There should be a lot of interest, even in China's own interest, to use the reserves to provide help to other countries, especially countries make investments and so on in countries where China has a long-term economic interest in. And then in terms of options and policy tools that are available to the Chinese government in order to get China out of this upcoming severe challenge to the domestic real economy. First of all, I have to say that because of the large tax revenue increases that have taken place in China over the last, especially 12 years, for example, last year, the tax revenue increased by more than 33% over 2006. And for the first half of this year, a similar rate of increase occurred. Of course, that's really bad because the government has taken too much money out of the pockets of families and also businesses. But at the same time, for the first half of this year, it provided a fiscal surplus of 1.2 trillion yuan, which is about 200 billion US dollars. That's roughly 4% of the Chinese GDP. So for the second half of this year, a much smaller surplus will occur. At least, it's a surplus, unlike large deficits for the US and other countries. China can use this large fiscal surplus to send tax rebates and give tax reductions to businesses and tax rebates to low and mid-income families. So that should provide some immediate boost and stimulus to the economy in the near future. So in fact, the more severe the impact of this financial crisis on the real economy in China, the more likely and the faster the Chinese government will take action to prevent a further deterioration in the economic situation. Of course, in the Chinese context, what they mean by a bad economic situation officially is defined to be a situation in which the GDP growth rate is below 8%. So for the third quarter of this year, the GDP growth rate came out to be 9%, which was announced just 3 days ago or so, which was a shock. So that got the Chinese government already panicking, looking for all kinds of actions to take. As a result of that, quite a few things have taken place, which I will get to in a moment. And then what about the national debt? If the fiscal surplus and also the profits from the state-owned enterprises is not sufficient to stimulate the economy to prevent a major shock, a major disaster on the economy, what about national debt? How much capacity is there? So roughly speaking, the Chinese national debt is about 15% of GDP. It's not that high. So if the government needs to borrow against the future to help stimulate the economy, it has a lot of capacity to do that. This is exactly what the Chinese government did back in the Asian financial crisis period of 1997-98. And it taught the Chinese government a very positive lesson. They learned that, well, borrowing against the future to stimulate the economy at the moment can be a very good thing. Well, I think they're probably going to do similar things again if they need to. So besides the physical surplus and the capacity, the large capacity to borrow against the future, one major remaining source of or untapped source of economic growth, potential growth for China is the state-owned assets. So according to, of course, many of you may have thought that after, let's say, privatization efforts over the last 30 years, China must be a mostly privately owned economy. But actually, it's not really like that. According to my calculation, state-owned land is worth about 50 trillion yuan, about $8 trillion US. Up to this point, land in China is either directly owned by the state or owned indirectly through collectives. So that has given a lot of wealth to the government through state ownership. And there are roughly 119,000 remaining state-owned enterprises with a total book value of 29 trillion yuan, which is about 45 trillion US dollars. So altogether, the wealth, the productive assets owned by the state come down to about 3/4 of China's national wealth. So this is something that has allowed China to engage in large infrastructure projects and large industrial projects over the last 30 years, because the government has not had to rely on capital markets to pool resources together. Instead, they can just make allocations and decisions where to spend the money, where to make more investments very freely, very efficiently. But as a result of that, that's why you see whenever the government wants to do big infrastructure projects, such as for the Olympic Games, it can easily do that. But of course, that has a lot of bad negative consequences. So this is why going forward, I think the government should, to some extent, depending on how bad the impact on the real economy will be by sometime early next year, the government may try to privatize the remaining assets. So this is why, to some extent, it's kind of surprising to see that China is still the only, probably only one of the few remaining countries that believe in free markets and also less socialism, because over the last 30 years, China has been trying to privatize, and I think over the next few years, it will privatize more. In fact, just last week, the government came out with a new fundamental reform that is to allow land use rights to be traded, to be used for collateral and other things. So this would have been unthinkable a few years ago, even a year ago, because I personally have participated in this big effort to push the government to privatize land ownership in China. So this time, in anticipation of the deteriorating economic situation for China, the government took some early action to stimulate consumption growth in the countryside and more business growth by allowing the farmers and peasants to be able to trade land use rights. In fact, the government is very committed to developing a national land use right market and also provide and maintain a land use right registration system to make that possible. So I think this step, and together with a possible privatization effort of the remaining state-owned enterprises, will help in the next few years to really transform the economic growth model and the foundation of the Chinese economy. So in that sense, actually, China will indeed become more and more free market oriented and more private economy oriented. instead of like the U.S. going the other way. So finally, why do I think the growth opportunities for China and for Brazil will be more in the intra-emerging markets economic exchanges, and less so on the China and developed countries' economic ties. Just to highlight this point quickly, over the last 5 years, the export growth rate from China to the U.S. has been coming down steadily. 5 years ago, the trade growth with the U.S. Increased by about 57%, but for the first half of this year, it has come down to about 10%. I think pretty soon, in a couple of months, it will probably go to zero or negative. But on the other hand, with Brazil, back in 2003, the total trade value with Brazil increased by 77%, last year by 137%, and earlier this year, 86%. So I have to say that, this sounds like too good to be true. The one question is whether this trend will actually continue. Well, I think even though I personally don't like the Chinese government to spend the stimulus money that will be committed in the next few years on infrastructure and industrial projects again, but I can assure you that they will definitely do that again, especially many subway projects have been approved for provincial capital cities in China. So that will mean a lot of demand for iron ore and other raw materials or even timber from Brazil. So, but I can give you a lot of statistics about this ongoing trend as to the importance of Brazil, India, and Africa and other emerging market countries for China. But because of the time, I don't want to bore you with too many details. But my point is, for China's considerations, of course, I have been talking to different people in China and also some Chinese corporations that have investments and representative offices here in Sao Paulo or other parts of Brazil. My general sense is that on the Chinese side, there's a lot of interest to want to invest more in Brazil. But on the Brazilian side, there has been maybe some suspicion or more hesitation. I have to say, as someone who grew up in China and who spends at least 2 or 3 months each year in China, the historical relationship between Brazil and China is really pretty good, partly because there was not much interaction, so no unpleasant legacy from the past. So this is why to the Chinese people, especially when they see more and more Brazilian grill houses being set up in China, and also how wonderful your football teams have been, because the Chinese football teams, even though they are among the best in Asia, just cannot compete with Brazil. So Brazil has been a very positive fascination to football fans and non-football fans in China. So this is why, by far, almost everyone in China has a very favorable opinion or attitude or impression of Brazil. But I don't know what it is like from your side. So I hope that there will be more interactions, more exchanges, just to improve the understanding of each other. I understand that in Sao Paulo there are over 200,000 Chinese living here. And I also, 2 days ago, I was happy to learn that there are about 10,000 Brazilians living in China, which surprised me somewhat, because I thought maybe very, very few Brazilians would want to live in China. How can they take Chinese food most of the time? Okay, thank you very much.